The silent visionary. The air was crisp that morning in Zurich International Airport. Business-class passengers sipped on champagne and typed away on gleaming MacBooks, some discussing market shares, others murmuring about tech IPOs. The air buzzed with conversations only the elite dared to entertain. Global trade, mergers, acquisitions, and how a company's quarterly results would shake Wall Street. Among them stood a man, modestly dressed in a navy blue zip-up sweater, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers. He carried nothing but a slim backpack, no designer suitcase or assistant trailing behind. His thin-rimmed glasses caught the airport lights as he glanced up at the departure board. Sundar Pichai. Most of them didn't recognize him, not in this crowd, not without the corporate suit, not without the media around. Here, in this high-paced world of private jets and high-powered deals, Sundar was just another passenger, quiet, reserved, ordinary to the untrained eye. He made his way to the check-in desk, politely offering a nod to the staff. The lady behind the counter, trained to cater to high-end clientele, glanced up with a forced smile. Her eyes flickered from his face to his attire, and then to the business class label on his booking. "Sir," she said, her tone hesitating ever so slightly, "are you sure this is your ticket? Business class." Sundar didn't flinch. He was used to this, being underestimated. It didn't bother him anymore. Not really. "Yes," he replied calmly. "Booked through corporate. Should be under Pichai. Sundar Pichai." She typed the name into the system, her brow furrowed as she looked at the confirmation. "Yes, well, it appears to be valid." But her voice dropped into uncertainty. "Do you work for Alphabet, sir, or Google perhaps?" "I do," he nodded. "I'm with Alphabet." Still unsure, she gave a tight smile. "One moment, sir." She clicked a few more buttons, picked up the phone, and turned slightly away as she whispered into the receiver. Sundar took a step back and waited patiently. A businessman behind him, clad in an expensive gray suit and Bluetooth earpiece, sighed audibly. Some people really push their luck. "First time in business class, huh?" he muttered, just loud enough. Sundar turned slightly, meeting his eyes with a calm that unnerved the man. But he said nothing. After a minute, the staff member returned. "All set, sir," she said, her tone a mix of formality and discomfort. "You may proceed to the lounge." "Thank you," Sundar said simply. As he walked away, the suited businessman shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." A different kind of joy. While sipping tea in the business class lounge, Sundar stared out the tall glass windows at the runway. He wasn't upset. He wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time the packaging had been mistaken for the product. He remembered something his father once told him while growing up in Chennai, India. "Let your work be your voice. If you ever feel unheard, it's okay. Your actions will always echo louder than noise." He smiled at the memory. Back in those days, their home was humble. One room, one telephone line shared by the entire building. No computers, no television, just dreams. Big ones. His father, an electrical engineer, used to bring home blueprints and circuits. Little Sundar would stare at them for hours, fascinated. He wasn't the loudest kid, or the smartest by typical standards. But he was curious. Intensely so. That curiosity never left him. At the IITs, while many fought for grades and placements, Sundar quietly immersed himself in systems design and computer engineering. He didn't aim to top exams. He aimed to solve problems. And when he got the opportunity to study at Stanford, he left India with a suitcase full of hopes and just enough money for a month. His mother had packed him food wrapped in newspaper. His father had withdrawn almost an entire year's salary to buy him the plane ticket. He made a silent vow on that flight. "If I ever make it, I'll never forget what it took to get here." The test of humility. Back at the lounge, an announcement came through. "Flight to San Francisco is now boarding. First and business class. Please proceed to gate B7." As Sundar made his way toward the gate, the same businessman from earlier appeared beside him. "Still here, huh?" he said with a smirk. "Thought you'd be in economy by now." Sundar gave a polite smile. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The man frowned slightly, still unable to place the face. At the gate, a tall airline supervisor approached Sundar before he boarded. "Mr. Pichai," he said warmly, "a pleasure to see you. We apologize for the earlier inconvenience." The businessman's ears perked up. "Thank you," Sundar replied, nodding. "No problem at all. Is there anything we can do for you? Additional privacy or onboard arrangements?" "That won't be necessary," Sundar said gently. "I prefer it simple." He stepped onto the plane. The businessman, now visibly puzzled, followed soon after. As he walked past the first few rows, his eyes went wide. Sundar was seated comfortably in seat 2A, chatting quietly with a flight attendant. Whispers began circulating. "Did you see who that is? I think he's someone big." A Google exec in first class finally whispered, "That's Sundar Pichai, CEO of Alphabet, the man who runs Google." The businessman turned pale. Invisible for ones, flying 35,000 feet above the clouds, Sundar leaned back in his seat, not with pride but with perspective. The truth is, the world often judges too quickly, by clothes, by accents, by silence. But greatness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and often it walks among us, unrecognized, underestimated, and unstoppable. In Sundar's world, true power was never in flashy watches or loud voices. It was in grace under pressure, in listening more than speaking, in building something that helped billions. He remembered the nights coding under a single bulb, the days walking miles to school, the thrill of his first dial-up internet connection. And now, here he was, flying not just across continents, but across dreams his family once whispered into the night sky. "Rooties in dust, IISO and stars." The humid air of Chennai in the 1980s didn't slow the rhythm of ambition in the Pichai household. Though the days were long and the nights offered little escape from the tropical heat, there was always movement in their small apartment, pages flipping, soldering irons buzzing faintly, the shuffle of footsteps as Sundar and his younger brother took turns sitting near the family's only fan during summer afternoons. Their home, no bigger than 600 square feet, was modest to the point of minimalism, but it pulsed with the quiet intensity of dreams forming in silence. Sundar's father, Raghunatha Pichai, was a man of few words, but when he spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. An electrical engineer at GEC, he would come home every evening, with grease on his hands and schematics tucked under his arm, setting them on the table as if they were sacred texts. Sundar would often sit beside him without asking, tracing the lines of the circuit diagrams with his fingers, his young mind trying to imagine the invisible energy flowing through those copper trails. His mother, Lakshmi, managed the household with the precision of an architect and the patience of a sage. She taught stenography and typing at a local institute, and though her days were full of routine tasks and responsibilities, she never once made her children feel like they were a burden. Her sacrifices were silent but deeply etched into the foundation of Sundar's values. The family did not have a car. They didn't even own a refrigerator until Sundar was in his late teens, but they had one thing that many of their wealthier neighbors seemed to lack: a fierce sense of purpose. The kind that wasn't always loud or decorated with accolades, but the kind that whispered from the corners of a well-read book or in the diligent posture of a boy who never missed a day of school, no matter the weather. Sundar was not what his classmates or teachers would have described as charismatic. He did not excel in cricket, nor did he charm crowds with humor or bravado. He was thin, quiet, observant, an old soul in a young body. But what set him apart, even then, was his focus. While other students memorized formulas, he tried to understand their roots. He wasn't satisfied with knowing what something was. He needed to know why it worked the way it did. He questioned the inner mechanics of calculators, radio transistors, and ceiling fans, sometimes dismantling small appliances at home, only to spend the next 3 hours putting them back together with more precision than when they started. His family's financial limitations were real. Often, he walked to school, his shoes threadbare, carrying books tied together with string because his school bag had torn. They couldn't afford multiple notebooks, so he developed the habit of writing small and neatly to save space, a discipline that later reflected in his razor-sharp focus during high-stakes meetings. Even at that age, Sundar never complained. He was acutely aware of how hard his parents worked, and he had long made peace with the understanding that his path would never be easy. But difficulty, he believed, was not a disadvantage, it was a forge. And in that forge, under pressure and poverty, his spirit was tempered. One of the more formative experiences of his youth came when the family got their first rotary telephone. It was mounted on the wall of the hallway in their building, and it wasn't theirs alone. The entire apartment block shared it. Sundar would stand by it sometimes, watching the adults take turns making calls. He became fascinated by the device, not just the mechanics, but how information traveled, how voices from distant lands reached their ears in real time. That curiosity grew roots in his mind and led him deeper into the world of electronics and communication. The idea that someone in one part of the world could impact the life of another instantly became something of an obsession. When he topped the local exams and earned a place at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur, it was not just a personal victory, it was a family celebration. The acceptance letter felt like a golden ticket, a promise that all the sacrifices, all the silence, all the late-night studies were leading somewhere tangible. But going to IIT meant leaving home, and for Sundar, it meant confronting the world without the protective cushion of familiarity. The first time he boarded a train alone, heading to the opposite side of the country, he clutched his belongings close and watched the changing landscapes with both awe and unease. IIT Kharagpur was an entirely new universe. The campus buzzed with ambition, competition, and an unspoken hierarchy that often revolved around confidence and connections. Sundar arrived with neither. While others formed cliques, played guitars in dorm lounges, or engaged in late-night debates, he kept mostly to himself. He spent hours in the library, reading about semiconductors, data structures, and the architecture of microprocessors. His professors began to notice his uncommon ability to not just understand a system but improve it. He didn't seek recognition, but recognition found him anyway. Still, his path to Stanford was far from simple. The admission letter arrived with joy, but the tuition fees brought tears. His father, upon reading the cost breakdown, sat in silence for a long time. The number was more than his entire annual salary. He knew what it meant, selling assets, borrowing from relatives, scraping together every last rupee. But in the end, he didn't hesitate. He walked into the room and said to Sundar, "Go. We'll find a way. Your future is bigger than this cost." So Sundar went. To America. To the land of silicon dreams and infinite skies. But his journey wasn't glamorous. He arrived with little more than a backpack, a set of second-hand clothes, and the simple confidence of someone who had climbed every step without a lift. Culture shows case and cold nights. At Stanford, everything was different. The buildings were massive, the libraries endless, and the resources overwhelming. But more than the infrastructure, it was the culture that shook him. Students spoke in fast-paced English, referenced books he hadn't read, and used words like IPO, VC funding, and market disruption with casual fluency. For someone who had grown up calculating every rupee and using hand-me-down electronics, the wealth and privilege around him were hard to digest. There were days he ate little, choosing to save money instead. Nights when he stayed up in the campus lab, not just out of passion, but because the heating in the dorms made his small room unbearably cold. He didn't complain, didn't post about it, didn't even share the hardships with his parents. He didn't want them to worry. He just worked harder. He poured himself into his research. He didn't network at fancy mixers, but he helped fellow students debug code or volunteered for late-night system tests. Slowly, his reputation grew, not as the most charismatic speaker, but as someone who could solve problems others couldn't. Professors started mentioning his name in faculty circles. One even said, "If this kid ever leads a team, the world should watch out." But leadership wasn't on Sundar's mind. Not yet. He still felt like an outsider in Silicon Valley, a visitor with a borrowed seat at the table. He worked part-time jobs, lived in shared apartments, took buses instead of Ubers, and lived a life that many of his peers had never tasted. And yet, through all of it, he carried with him a deep humility. A humility that didn't stem from insecurity, but from gratitude. Gratitude for the people who had sacrificed so he could be there. Gratitude for the fact that even if he failed, he had still made it farther than most would ever imagine. The man who would not boast. By the time Sundar joined Google years later, as part of a modest product management team, his resume wasn't the most dazzling. He wasn't the loudest in meetings, nor did he throw around buzzwords. But when he spoke, he brought ideas that made others pause. One of his earliest contributions involved pitching the idea for a streamlined, faster, more integrated web browser, which eventually became Google Chrome. At the time, many executives weren't convinced. Why reinvent the wheel? Some had argued. But Sundar persisted, not with pressure, but with patience. He built prototypes. He collected data. He showed them, not just told them, what the future could look like. And slowly, the tide turned. That's how it always was with him. No loud declarations, no credit stealing, just consistent, quiet excellence. And that perhaps is the heart of this story, not just of how a boy from a one-bedroom home in India made it to the top of Silicon Valley, but how he did it without ever losing his kindness, his respect for others, and his ability to see dignity in even the smallest of roles. He didn't carry his success like a sword. He carried it like a torch, illuminating paths for others. The VIGHT of the ages he wrote on. Sundar Pichai's office wasn't the biggest one on Google's sprawling Mountain View campus, but it was the one where the most important decisions were often made, not because of the title on his door, but because of the trust he had quietly earned. There was no gold-plated nameplate, no extravagant artwork, no oversized leather chair. Just a simple desk, a whiteboard filled with ideas, and a quiet man who had become the cornerstone of a global company, not through ambition for dominance, but through a lifetime of choosing understanding over ego, logic over noise, and compassion over control. By the time Sundar became a senior executive, the corridors of Google had changed. The startup energy had matured into corporate discipline. Innovations that once came from garages were now birthed in glass towers and multi-million-dollar R&D labs. Every day was a race to be faster, smarter, and bigger than competitors. And in that race, many lost themselves. The culture had started to shift. The line between creativity and politics began to blur. Executives fought for control behind polished smiles. Meetings became arenas where credit was currency, and silence could be mistaken for weakness. But Sundar remained the anomaly. He didn't fight for the microphone in meetings. He didn't step on others to elevate himself. Instead, he listened. Fully. Not the kind of listening that waits for a pause to respond, but the kind that seeks to understand the tension beneath the words, the fear behind the resistance, and the truth behind the data. It was this ability, not his degrees, not his technical genius, that made people trust him. Engineers found in him a leader who understood their language. Product managers saw someone who didn't just talk strategy, but who had once written code, debugged systems, and stayed up all night just to fix one broken line that could crash a project. But leadership, real leadership, comes with its own kind of loneliness. The higher Sundar rose, the more he found himself in rooms where his calm demeanor was misread as detachment, his humility mistaken for passivity. Some peers, fueled by ambition and blinded by the spotlight, began to question his style. Whispers circulated in closed-door conversations. Is he assertive enough? Does he have the killer instinct to lead at the top? In tech, after all, being loud often passed for being brilliant, and Sundar was neither loud nor eager to dominate. What those whispers missed was the strength beneath his stillness. Sundar had endured more storms in silence than most could survive with support. He had faced hunger, cultural isolation, academic pressure, and the crippling weight of debt, all without ever complaining. Now, sitting in boardrooms with billion-dollar decisions on the table, he didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He had long ago mastered the art of making silence feel louder than arrogance. One such pivotal moment came when Google was considering acquiring a small, rising startup specializing in AI voice recognition. The boardroom was divided. Half the executives dismissed the acquisition, calling it premature, overpriced, and unnecessary. The other half wanted it badly, driven more by fear of competition than vision. The room buzzed with tension. Numbers flew across the screen, and voices clashed with growing impatience. In the middle of it all, Sundar sat with his chin resting on his hand, listening. He hadn't spoken a word. Then, as the room reached a tipping point, one voice called out, "Sundar, you've been quiet. You've seen the tech demo. You've talked to their engineers. What's your take?" The room went silent. Sundar looked around, and with his characteristic calm, said, "Everyone's talking about risk. I understand that. But here's what I see. This startup doesn't just have technology. It has integrity in the way it's been built. Their code is elegant. Their engineers are passionate. And they're solving a problem that will become central to how humans interact with machines. If we don't act on vision now, we'll be chasing someone else's roadmap in 5 years." He paused, then continued, "We're Google. We're not supposed to follow. We lead." There was no dramatic pitch, no raised voice, just clarity, purpose, insight. The room voted. The acquisition was approved. 5 years later, that startup's AI would become the backbone of Google Assistant. That was Sundar. But success at that level doesn't come without cost. When success demands your soul. As Sundar climbed higher, so did the stakes. The higher you go, the more visible you become, and visibility brings scrutiny. Every decision he made became a headline. Every silence he kept became a subject of speculation. Internally, he now had to manage not just products, but people, teams with histories, egos, and hidden tensions. He had to learn how to lead not just engineers, but lawyers, marketers, public policy teams, and government liaisons. In one particularly challenging year, Google found itself under intense public pressure for issues related to privacy, misinformation, and internal dissent over partnerships that some employees believed crossed ethical lines. Town halls turned tense. Protests formed within campus walls. Media circled like vultures. The world expected Sundar to take a side, to come out swinging, to lay blame or proclaim certainty. But Sundar didn't rush to the podium. He did what he always did. He listened. For days, he held quiet conversations with employees at every level. Not just VPs, but junior developers, ethics researchers, and even cafeteria staff who had their own views. He read hundreds of emails personally. He invited voices that were rarely heard in executive spaces. And when he finally spoke to the entire company, he didn't give a corporate speech. He told a story about his first email account, about the wonder he felt when he realized the internet could connect people across borders, about the weight of responsibility that came with shaping tools used by billions. "I didn't come here to build the loudest company," he said, his voice steady. "I came here to help build the most responsible one." The room didn't erupt in applause, but it didn't need to. There was something more powerful than applause in that moment: alignment. That's the thing about authentic leadership. It doesn't dazzle, it resonates. But even as Sundar guided the company with grace, the personal toll was growing. He was now traveling more than ever, moving from country to country, meeting with heads of state, speaking at conferences, testifying before lawmakers, managing crisis after crisis. The weight was relentless. His family saw less of him. His children grew up between calendars. There were nights he stared at hotel ceilings in foreign cities, wondering if the path he walked, however noble, was costing him the most precious years of his personal life. But in those moments of doubt, he always returned to one truth. His purpose was bigger than the pressure. He wasn't just building products. He was building possibilities for the next Sundar Pichai, sitting somewhere in a small room in Chennai, trying to make sense of circuit boards and dreaming about stars. The mark of a true leader. There's a quote Sundar kept pinned on the wall of his home office, just above his desk. It wasn't from a tech guru or a CEO. It was from his mother. She once told him, "People will remember you less for what you built, and more for how you made them feel while building it." That became his silent compass. And so he stayed kind, even when the world was cruel. He stayed curious, even when others became complacent. He stayed grounded, even as he rose to the highest office in one of the most powerful companies on earth. He still answered emails personally. He still asked interns what they were working on. He still paused in the hallway when someone needed 5 minutes of his time. Not because he had to, but because he knew what it felt like to be invisible. And he had vowed never to become the kind of leader who forgot the value of being seen. Stories from within. By the time Sundar Pichai stood at the summit of Google's towering success, the view from the top had begun to change. From this height, the world did not look like a landscape of victories. It looked like a battlefield of choices, a chessboard of moral complexity, where every move had a consequence, every silence was a statement, and every decision came at a cost. For years, Sundar had navigated that battlefield with quiet precision, trusting that his integrity and clarity of purpose would guide him through the chaos. But nothing could have prepared him for the storm that began not from the outside, but from within. It started subtly. A few skipped meetings, memos that didn't reach his desk on time, proposals approved without his signature. It was unlike the Google he had helped nurture, a place built on transparency, collaboration, and open culture. There were murmurs among senior leadership, hushed conversations in corners, passing glances that said more than words ever could. He noticed that some of the new appointees, brought in by external recruitment heads, had little understanding of the company's core mission. They were tacticians, not visionaries. They came from industries where leadership meant dominance, not direction. And slowly, those new energies began to shift the atmosphere from a culture of builders to a culture of shareholders. Numbers began to override nuance. Metrics replaced meaning. But Sundar remained steady, at least outwardly. Internally, he was waging a quiet war of concern. He believed deeply in the power of technology to elevate lives, not just profits. For him, Google's mission, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, was not just a tagline. It was a promise, one he had held on to since the day he first used a computer at IIT Kharagpur and realized that data, when democratized, could liberate minds and economies alike. He had lived through the digital divide. He had felt what it meant to not have access. And now, he was watching the platform he helped build lean dangerously toward monetization over meaning. Then came the deal. A powerful conglomerate, backed by geopolitical interests and immense capital, approached Google with an offer that appeared dazzling on the surface. An exclusive data-sharing partnership that would grant Google deeper access into emerging markets, billions in investment for cloud infrastructure, and a seat at the global table of digital governance. The proposal came wrapped in golden statistics, growth charts, and a futuristic vision of AI-led innovation. But Sundar saw through it. Beneath the promise was a pitfall, a clause buried deep in the contract that allowed covert data harvesting under the pretext of regional customization. It was, in essence, an invitation to compromise the privacy and digital freedom of millions in the name of progress. When Sundar raised his concerns, he expected debate. He did not expect resistance. But resistance came, not from external pressure, but from within Google's very board. A faction of executives, driven by quarterly goals and shareholder pressure, argued that Sundar was being overly cautious, even naive. "This is the future," one said. "We have a responsibility to compete." Another added, "Privacy is a flexible standard across regions. Why should we hold ourselves back while others leap ahead?" Sundar felt a cold weight settle in his chest. These were not disagreements based on strategy. These were fractures in philosophy. And when philosophy cracks, the foundation of leadership begins to shake. What followed was a series of boardroom confrontations that slowly eroded the trusts Sundar had spent years building. He found himself isolated in key decisions, outvoted on matters of ethical policy, and even bypassed in regulatory discussions where he had once led. It was not a coup in the traditional sense, but it was a quiet sidelining. His humility, once admired, was now seen as hesitation. His caution, once called wisdom, was being labeled weakness. He could have retaliated. He had allies in Washington, former engineers who owed their careers to him, loyalists scattered across every continent of Google's vast empire. But Sundar had never been a man for vengeance. That wasn't his way. Instead, he did what he had always done in moments of trial. He looked inward. He returned to the core question: who am I when everything is on the line? The cost of standing still. One evening, long after the lights had dimmed, and the campus was quiet, Sundar sat alone in his office. A single lamp cast a warm glow over a notebook on his desk. On the first page were 4 questions he had written to himself. Can I still lead with truth? Am I protecting the people who trust us? Have I allowed fear to guide me? Would my parents be proud of this version of me? He stared at them for a long time. The next morning, he declined the partnership deal. Officially, he cited ethical misalignment and long-term strategic risk. But unofficially, the message was clear. Google will not compromise user trust for corporate gain, not on my watch. The fallout was swift. Stock prices wavered. Media outlets speculated about internal conflict. Whispers of a potential CEO transition spread across the valley. Investors panicked. And in the shadows of all this, the same executives who had once stood beside him now began lobbying for a restructuring of leadership to align with global competitiveness. Sundar knew what was happening. He was being pushed out, but not with the drama of a firing. No, it would be dressed in polite language, corporate euphemisms, and talks of future opportunities. It would be framed as a mutual decision, a graceful exit, and he was ready. Because Sundar had never led for the position, he had led for the mission. And the mission, he now realized, might no longer be welcome in the boardroom. The NIJT, he almost walel ki de away. 1 week later, Sundar found himself in Zurich once again. The same city where years ago, an airline attendant had questioned his place in business class. He was there for a private leadership summit. Ironically, now as the man whom the world recognized, even if his own company had started to forget who he truly was. That night, after speaking to a group of young tech founders about ethical innovation, he returned to his hotel and stood on the balcony, looking out at the lights shimmering over Lake Zurich. He thought about leaving. Not just Google, but tech. Entirely. He imagined going back to India, starting a foundation for underprivileged engineers, investing in rural internet infrastructure, creating schools where kids didn't have to dream of Stanford. They could build their own institutions of excellence right at home. It was a beautiful vision. Peaceful, purposeful. But as he stood there, the wind brushing past, he received a message on his phone. It was from a Google intern he had once met in passing, 3 years earlier. The message read, "You don't know this, but you once asked me what I wanted to build, not where I wanted to work. You were the first person who saw me as more than a resume. I'm now leading a team at Google Health, and I try to lead with the same humility you taught me in that one 5-minute conversation. I hope you're staying." Sundar read the message again, then again. He smiled, and he stayed. Not because the throne mattered, but because the mission wasn't finished. The root C's of a legacy. The thing about legacy is that it does not begin when you leave. It begins when you choose to stay. Not for applause, not for power, but because you believe that walking away, while easier, is not the same as letting go with grace. After the storm that had swept through Google's internal hierarchy and tested Sundar Pichai's resolve, many believed he would fade quietly, accepting the political maneuvering of corporate strategy. What they did not count on was that Sundar had never needed a title to lead. His strength had never come from position, it came from purpose. And that purpose now found a new direction, not in dominance, but in nurturing a culture he had spent his life defending. The weeks following his public sidelining were strange. Officially, Sundar remained CEO, but the authority beneath that title had been hollowed out. Some meetings excluded him. Strategic initiatives moved ahead without his final approval. New boardroom dynamics were forming. Yet Sundar neither fought nor flinched. Instead, he began building something far deeper, something invisible to the corporate eye, but powerful enough to transform the soul of the organization. He turned his attention inward, toward the people. Not the top executives, not the power brokers, but the engineers, designers, thinkers, and quiet innovators who still believed in the essence of Google, the belief that technology should serve, not exploit. He began hosting intimate roundtable discussions late in the evening, far from the executive suite, in one of the older, less adorned buildings on the edge of campus. There, surrounded by whiteboards, tangled wires, and the smell of fresh coffee, Sundar reignited what had once made Google a haven for creators. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat among them, equal, curious, open. In those sessions, he asked different questions. Not about deadlines, but about dreams. Not about market size, but about meaning. He wanted to know what kept young engineers up at night. Not in fear, but in wonder. What would they build if money weren't a factor? What problem would they solve if they didn't have to justify it to investors? Slowly, these conversations began to blossom into real initiatives, internal incubators, ethical innovation hubs, and cross-disciplinary labs, where imagination was given space again, and people came, not just to listen, but to contribute. Those who had once felt unseen in the system found voice and value in these gatherings. A quiet revolution began to pulse beneath the surface of the company. Sundar was planting seeds, not of rebellion, but of rebirth. What set him apart was his refusal to engage in petty retaliation. He didn't undercut the new power structure, didn't stir gossip, didn't feed narratives to the media. Instead, he chose a deeper, more enduring path, shaping culture through influence rather than instruction. He poured his energy into mentoring young leaders, especially those from underrepresented communities, often giving time that no one expected from a CEO, let alone one under siege. He saw in them the reflection of who he once was, uncertain but filled with raw purpose, waiting for someone to believe in their voice before they had the confidence to speak. Among these emerging voices was a young woman named Anya Mehta, a systems engineer from Delhi who had recently joined Google on a global leadership scholarship. She had been working late one night when Sundar passed by her lab and asked what she was building. She was startled, not because he spoke to her, but because he listened. Really listened. Anya had been working on a scalable low-data internet protocol for rural networks, inspired by the patchy connection she had grown up with in the Himalayan foothills. Most senior reviewers had dismissed the idea as impractical. Sundar, however, saw a future in it. "Don't make it smaller for them," he told her. "Make the world big enough to include their version of the internet." Those words lit a fire in Anya. With his backing, not through formal authority, but through personal mentorship, She built a prototype that would later become the foundation of a new Google initiative aimed at bridging the final digital gaps across remote regions globally. It was not marketed loudly, nor launched with fireworks, but it quietly changed lives, enabling education, commerce, and communication for thousands who had never been seen on a map before. Stories like Anya's began to echo across the corridors. Slowly, Sundar's quiet leadership reshaped the company not from the top down, but from the soul outward. The people began to remember not just who Sundar was, but what Google was supposed to be. Even some of those who had once sought to displace him began to reassess. They saw the numbers stabilizing, not from aggressive tactics, but from internal harmony. They saw retention rates improving. They saw creativity surging again. And behind all of it was the man they had nearly pushed out, still showing up every day, not to be right, but to do what was right. One pivotal moment came at the annual Global Summit, where Google showcased its most ambitious innovations to the world. That year, for the first time, Sundar was not listed as the keynote speaker. The new board-chosen executive would open the event. But in a quiet twist of fate, the most celebrated presentation came not from the official keynote, but from a team of young engineers led by Anya, presenting their low-data protocol project, an initiative that had started in a forgotten corner of the company, championed only by Sundar. The applause was thunderous, and when she finished, Anya stepped aside, turned to the front row where Sundar sat, no longer in the spotlight, and said into the microphone, "We are here today because someone believed that leadership is not about being heard first, but about listening when no one else does. Sundar Pichai, this is your legacy." The room fell into a long, rising, standing ovation. And in that moment, titles ceased to matter. After the summit, things shifted again. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. The board, once so eager to redefine leadership, began to revisit its assumptions. Investors took notice of the renewed cultural strength. Employees began referencing Sundar's internal discussions as a standard for team development. And eventually, without press releases or reshuffles, the center of power began to reorient, not by decree, but by gravity. Vision attracts, integrity endures, humility leads. Sundar did not reclaim power in the traditional sense. He didn't need to. What he reclaimed was influence, not the kind measured in media appearances, but the kind that is whispered in boardrooms, sought out in private emails, and trusted in crisis. His quiet mentorship model became a blueprint across departments. His evening roundtables evolved into a company-wide innovation council, and his presence, once nearly sidelined, became the very backbone of Google's next chapter. One evening, he walked the quiet path between Building 42 and the company garden, watching the moon reflect off the water of the man-made lake. He passed a group of interns laughing, brainstorming ideas with that wild-eyed energy he remembered from his own early days. One of them looked up, recognized him, and simply nodded. Sundar nodded back. No entourage, no headlines, just mutual respect. And perhaps that was the essence of real legacy, not a monument built in your honor, but a garden you've planted where others can grow without asking your permission. Beyond the THCOD, into EKKE world. Years had passed since Sundar Pichai's name first became synonymous with quiet leadership, ethical vision, and technological revolution. Yet despite the titles, the press, and the praise, there remained a part of him that never left the narrow flat in Chennai where his dreams first sprouted. He often said the world might know him as CEO, but inside, he was still the boy who waited in line to use a shared telephone, who borrowed books he could not afford to buy, and who learned that silence often carries more power than noise. That boy had grown into a man who led one of the most powerful companies on earth. But now, a new question loomed. After everything, what comes next? The moment that seeded this question didn't come with fanfare. It arrived in the form of an envelope, One small beige letter slipped into the stack of corporate briefings and summit invitations that arrived at his desk each morning. But unlike the glossy folders or embossed cards it came with, this envelope bore no company seal. It was hand-addressed in familiar looping Tamil script. Inside was a letter from his mother's oldest friend, Mrs. Rajalakshmi, now in her 70s, still living in the same Chennai neighborhood where Sundar had grown up. Her words were simple, but her tone carried a weight that moved him more than any shareholder report ever could. She wrote of the neighborhood's fading light, how the new generation was leaving, how the schools were outdated, how young students with the same hunger Sundar once had were losing their path in the noise of modern distraction and limited opportunity. She ended the letter with a single question. Sundar, will you come back, not just to visit, but to help? For hours after reading it, he sat in silence. The office around him buzzed with activity. Assistants pacing, screens flickering with global markets, news tickers running under his window. But inside him, everything slowed. That one question echoed louder than the countless demands placed upon him each day. Would he go back? Could he? By this point in his life, Sundar had nothing left to prove. He had guided Google through technological revolutions, steered it through ethical upheaval, and shaped it into a company that had, under his influence, rediscovered its moral compass. He had already become more than a leader. He had become a symbol. And symbols, as the world knows, are rarely allowed to rest. Yet in that moment, as the sun set behind the Santa Cruz Mountains and the office lights dimmed one by one, he didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a man standing at a crossroad that no algorithm could help him navigate. What do you do when your dream has been realized, and yet your heart pulls you in a different direction? Sundar decided to pause everything. He took a temporary leave, not as a PR move, not for optics, but because he needed silence, not strategies. For the first time in over a decade, he traveled with no agenda, no press coverage, and no entourage. He boarded a flight to Chennai, alone, without alerting the media, and arrived under the early morning haze that hung like a soft memory over the city's skyline. Stepping out of the airport, he didn't wear sunglasses or a blazer. Just a cotton shirt, khaki trousers, and that quiet demeanor that had never changed. As he moved through the familiar roads, past old bakeries, temples, bookstores, and tea stalls, people glanced at him, but few stared. To them, he was familiar, but distant, like a story passed down rather than a person seen every day. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He returned to his childhood home, now modestly maintained by a caretaker, its paint faded, the gate slightly rusted, but the spirit inside untouched. He sat in his old room, still bearing faint pencil marks on the walls, books from school stacked in the corner, a broken radio on the shelf, and he allowed himself, finally, to breathe without responsibility. Over the following weeks, he visited schools in the area, met with young students, teachers, and local leaders. He listened, once again, more than he spoke. He asked questions not as a CEO, but as someone who knew what it felt like to sit in the back of a classroom and dream of a life no one around you could quite understand. He watched the way students adapted to phones but lacked meaningful digital education. He saw kids coding on cracked screens, attending school in buildings with no ventilation, trying to translate ambition into action with broken tools. And with each visit, something within him reawakened, not nostalgia, but necessity. It wasn't long before word got out. Local media caught a glimpse. Then national outlets. Questions swirled. Was Sundar leaving Google? Was he planning something new? But Sundar didn't speak publicly. Not yet. He didn't want a press narrative. He wanted purpose. And so, in the midst of rising curiosity, he quietly began the groundwork for something that would become his true legacy. Not just a name in a boardroom, but a movement with roots in the soil he came from. He called it Project Vidya, the Sanskrit word for knowledge. It wasn't a foundation, not in the traditional sense. It was a living initiative. Technology labs built inside schools, coding education tailored for regional languages, mentorship networks linking Indian students to global professionals, and rural innovation hubs that empowered local communities to solve their own problems through microtechnology and ethical AI. He invested not just capital, but himself, his time, his experience, his global network. Former colleagues, inspired by his vision, joined him. Engineers from Google volunteered sabbaticals. Educators across the diaspora reached out. And slowly, Project Vidya spread, first in Tamil Nadu, then in West Bengal, then into Maharashtra and the Northeast. Back at Google, leadership evolved. New executives rose, but the culture Sundar had cultivated endured. His influence remained, not as policy, but as principle. Employees still cited his mentorship practices. Ethics committees used his frameworks. And every year, during the Global Summit, a portion of the agenda was dedicated to foundations of responsible tech, a term coined by Sundar himself. Then, 1 year after he left, an offer came from the United Nations, a global initiative to shape the digital charter for developing nations. They wanted him to lead it, not as a CEO, but as a steward of values, someone who had balanced innovation and integrity at scale. Sundar declined the title, but not the mission. He agreed to advise, to shape, to listen, to teach, not from the stage, but from within. And so, his journey came full circle, not by ending in retirement, but by expanding into something far greater. He had become what few in the world managed to become, a quiet giant, shaping history without needing to be seen doing it. EPIOGE, the man who built bridges. Years later, when asked to describe Sundar Pichai in a documentary chronicling the evolution of ethical tech, one of his former mentees said something that captured the essence of this story. He wasn't the man who wanted the crown. He was the man who wore it only to break it into pieces and build bridges with it. And perhaps that is the truest form of greatness, not in commanding power, but in walking beside those who are still finding their voice. Not in creating empires, but in planting forests of opportunity. And in every corner of the world where a student writes their first line of code, where a village accesses the internet for the first time, or where a child sees themselves in a leader who once walked barefoot to school, there, Sundar Pichai's legacy lives on. Not in stone, but in people.